They called him the Gargoyle. To the hundreds of people who walked past his cage every weekend, he wasn't just a dog, he was a mistake of nature. With a jaw that twisted sharply to the left, leaving 3 bottom teeth permanently exposed in a jagged snarl, and patches of fur missing from a stubborn skin condition that turned his back into a map of scars, he was the definition of unlovable. One of his eyes was a milky blue, blind and wandering, while the other was a piercing, desperate amber. Children would point and ask what was wrong with him. Parents would pull them away, whispering that he looked dangerous. But the most heartbreaking part wasn't his face. It was his spirit. After 3 years in the shelter, the Gargoyle had stopped barking. He had stopped jumping against the chain-link fence. He had learned the cruelest lesson a dog can learn. Invisibility is safer than rejection. While the golden retrievers and the bouncy terriers in the front row wagged their tails and went home to warm beds, this dog sat in the shadows of the back corridor, facing the concrete wall. The shelter staff had already marked his paperwork with a red stamp. His time was up. Monday morning was going to be his end. Everyone saw a monster. Everyone saw a burden. But they missed the one detail that would eventually bring a grown man to his knees in tears. They missed the way his good eye tracked the movement of dust motes in the light, hoping one of them was a hand reaching out. They didn't know that the ugliest dog in the state held the key to saving a family that was falling apart. All it took was a single, terrifying moment and a piece of leftover sandwich to change history. Elias Thorne didn't want a dog. He wanted a reason to get out of bed. Since his wife Sarah had passed away 2 years ago, the silence in his house had become a physical weight, pressing down on his chest the moment he woke up. The house was immaculate, too clean, too quiet, and entirely devoid of life. His daughter Maya had stopped visiting as often, unable to bear the gloom that seemed to cling to her father like a second skin. Elias was drowning in his own solitude, a man fading away in a beige armchair, watching the seasons change through a window he never opened. It was his doctor who suggested the shelter. "Get something to care for, Elias," he had said, scribbling a prescription that wasn't for pills. "You need a heartbeat in that house besides your own." Elias drove to the city shelter on a rainy Sunday, mostly to prove the doctor wrong. He walked through the aisles with his hands deep in his coat pockets, feeling out of place. The noise was deafening, a cacophony of yips, howls, and metal clanging. He saw beautiful dogs, puppies with soft eyes, energetic collies that could catch a frisbee in midair. But Elias felt nothing for them. They were too happy. They required an energy he simply didn't possess. He felt like a fraud standing in front of them. He was about to leave, his hand already on the exit door handle, when he took a wrong turn down the special needs corridor. It was quieter there. The smell of bleach was stronger. This was where the broken ones lived, and that was when he saw the lump of matted grey fur in the corner of the last cage. The dog wasn't begging. He was simply waiting for the end. Elias stopped. For the first time in 2 years, he looked at another living creature and felt like he was looking in a mirror. The volunteer looked from Elias to the cage number on her clipboard, then back to Elias, her expression a mix of confusion and professional pity. "Sir, are you sure about this one? Number 412. Well, he's scheduled for tomorrow morning. He has significant behavioral shutdown and extensive medical needs. He's really not a starter dog." Elias didn't move his eyes from the hunched creature in the corner of the concrete cell. The dog had finally lifted his heavy head, that one piercing amber eye fixing on Elias with an intensity that burned through the chain link. It wasn't a look of hope. It was an assessment of a new threat. "He's not a number," Elias said, his voice rusty from disuse, surprised by his own firmness, "and I'm not looking for a starter. I'm looking for him." The paperwork felt impossibly heavy. The shelter waived the fees. They just wanted him gone before the inevitable happened. When a staff member brought him out on a cheap nylon slip leash, the dog didn't walk. He pancaked to the floor, a trembling bundle of jutting bones and scarred skin. Elias had to carry him, enduring the smell of fear and old urine, out to his pristine sedan. He decided to name him Atlas because the creature looked like he was carrying the weight of an entire miserable world on his scarred shoulders. The drive home was suffocating. Atlas sat frozen in the passenger footwell, drooling excessively from sheer terror. Every time Elias shifted gears, the dog flinched violently. When they arrived at the silent house, Elias had to carry him again, setting him down in the polished slate entryway. The house felt even bigger, colder and emptier than usual. Atlas looked around with his mismatched eyes, taking in the antique furniture, the white carpets, and the fragile porcelain figurines Sarah had collected. He immediately crouched low, tail tucked so deeply between his legs it practically touched his chest. He looked like a muddy gargoyle dropped into a fine art museum. He was waiting to be yelled at, waiting to be told he didn't belong in a place this clean. Elias put down a stainless steel bowl of expensive kibble and fresh water in the kitchen. Atlas didn't move from the doormat. He wouldn't even look at the food. Hours passed. The sun went down, casting long, creeping shadows across the living room that used to echo with Sarah's laughter and piano playing. Elias sat in his beige armchair, watching the dog, and the dog watched the wall. The silence here was somehow louder than the barking at the shelter. It began to feel like a terrible mistake. What was a broken man doing with an even more broken animal? Around midnight, Elias couldn't take the cavernous distance anymore. He got up, his stiff knees popping in the quiet, and walked to the entryway. He didn't try to pet the dog or offer a treat. Instead, he grabbed a throw cushion from the sofa and sat down on the hard floor, about 3 feet away from Atlas. He just sat there, leaning against the wall, mirroring the dog's isolation. "It's okay," Elias whispered into the dark, his voice cracking. "I don't know how to be here anymore either." For the first time since leaving the cage, Atlas let out a long, shuddering sigh that rattled his ribs. Slowly, painfully, he lowered his heavy head and rested his twisted jaw on his front paws. They sat together in the dark, two ghosts haunting the same house, silently agreeing to just exist in the same space. The first 2 weeks were a test of endurance. Atlas lived his life entirely under the heavy oak dining table. It became his fortress. He only emerged late at night to drink water or quickly relieve himself in the backyard before scrambling back to safety. To the neighbors, Elias had lost his mind. Mrs. Gable, who lived next door and pruned her roses with surgical precision, actually crossed the street to avoid walking past Elias's driveway when the beast was visible through the window. "He looks like he's been stitched together from spare parts, Elias," she had sniffed one morning. "Are you sure he's sanitary?" Elias had simply grunted and closed the door. But the real challenge came when his daughter, Maya, finally visited. She walked in, saw the pair of glowing eyes in the shadows under the table, and gasped. When Atlas shuffled out, stumbling slightly on his bad leg, revealing his twisted jaw and patchy fur, she recoiled. "Dad," she whispered, stepping back. "My God, why? There are so many nice dogs. This one looks evil. He looks like a nightmare." "He's not a nightmare, Maya," Elias said, his voice surprisingly sharp. He looked at his daughter, really looked at her, and saw the same fear that everyone else projected onto the dog. "He's just a survivor, and frankly this house has been full of nightmares for 2 years, at least his are on the outside." Maya left early, unsettling the air. The rejection hung heavy in the room. Atlas sensed it. He retreated deeper under the table, pressing his nose against the floorboards, letting out a low, mournful whine. That evening, a thunderstorm rolled in. The sky turned a bruised purple, and the house shook with thunder. Elias sat in the kitchen, eating a turkey sandwich, listening to the rain hammer against the glass. He felt a familiar wave of grief washing over him, the kind that usually made him retreat to his bedroom. But then he heard a scratching sound. Atlas had crawled out. The thunder terrified him more than the human did. The dog was shaking so violently his teeth chattered. He didn't run away. Instead, he pressed his scarred flank against Elias's leg. It was a desperate, instinctive move, seeking an anchor in the storm. Elias froze. He barely breathed. Slowly, he tore off a corner of his turkey sandwich. It was a small piece, nothing special. He held it out in his open palm, lowering his hand to the dog's level. "It's just turkey, buddy," Elias murmured. "It's safe." Atlas hesitated. His milky blue eye rolled nervously, but his good amber eye locked onto Elias. He sniffed. Then, with agonizing slowness, he reached forward, His twisted teeth scraped gently against Elias's skin. Not a bite, but a caress. He took the meat. Then something miraculous happened. Atlas didn't retreat. He rested his heavy, blocky head on Elias's knee. The warmth of the dog seeped through Elias's trousers. Elias rested his hand on the dog's neck, right over a patch of scarred skin where the fur refused to grow. The texture was rough, imperfect, and real. "We're quite a pair, aren't we?" Elias whispered, stroking the dog's head. The old man and the gargoyle. For the first time in years, the house didn't feel empty. It felt occupied. You know, watching Elias share that simple sandwich reminds me that sometimes the biggest miracles happen in the quietest moments. We all have scars, some on our skin, some on our hearts, and we're all just looking for someone who doesn't mind sitting with us through the thunderstorms. I'm trying to build something different here, not just a channel, but a little family of people who believe that broken things are actually the most beautiful. If that sounds like a place you want to be, I'd love for you to stick around. You don't have to be perfect here. You just have to be you. Tell me in the comments below. Have you ever loved an animal or a person that the rest of the world didn't understand? I read your stories, and honestly, they are the best part of my day. The change didn't happen overnight, but it happened with the steady, undeniable rhythm of a healing heartbeat. 6 months later, the beige armchair was no longer Elias's prison. The mornings were no longer silent. They were filled with the click-clack of Atlas's claws on the hardwood floor, a sound that used to annoy Elias in his old life, but now served as his alarm clock, signaling that he was needed. Elias had started walking again. At first it was just to the mailbox and back, keeping Atlas hidden from the neighborhood's judgment. But as the dog grew stronger, his coat gaining a hint of shine and his ribs vanishing under solid muscle, Elias found a new kind of courage. He bought a sturdy red harness that hugged Atlas's broad chest and began taking him to the town park. The reactions were predictable. Mothers pulled their strollers to the opposite side of the path. Joggers widened their berth, eyeing the jagged twist of Atlas's jaw with undisguised alarm. They saw a fighting dog, a beast, a danger. Elias walked with his head high, his hand firmly gripping the leash, radiating a protective energy he hadn't felt since Maya was a toddler. He wasn't just walking a dog, he was escorting a king in exile. One crisp autumn afternoon, the true test came. Elias was raking leaves in the front yard, Atlas dozing in a pile of maple leaves nearby, looking like a mythical creature guarding a hoard of gold. A car pulled into the driveway. It was Maya. She hadn't visited in weeks, claiming work was crazy, but Elias knew she was avoiding the house, avoiding the memories of her mother, and avoiding the monster her father had brought home. She stepped out of the car, looking pale and exhausted. Her eyes were red-rimmed. She didn't even say hello. She just walked up the driveway, dropped her purse on the grass, and burst into tears. It was the kind of sudden, overwhelming grief that comes when you've been holding the world up for too long. She covered her face with her hands, sobbing into the chilly air. Elias froze, clutching his rake. He was a man of few words, and since Sarah died, he had forgotten how to comfort anyone, especially his adult daughter. He took a step forward, awkward and uncertain. But Atlas didn't hesitate. The gargoyle rose from the leaves. He didn't bark, he didn't rush. He moved with a solemn, heavy purpose. He trotted over to Maya, his mismatched eyes focused entirely on her shaking shoulders. "Atlas, no!" Elias called out softly, afraid the dog would jump or scare her further. Atlas ignored him. He walked right up to Maya and sat down on her foot. It was a grounding technique, a solid weight anchoring her to the earth. Then he leaned his entire 80-pound body against her legs, pressing his scarring side into her expensive slacks. He lifted his head, that twisted, terrifying jaw parting slightly to let out a soft whine, and nudged her hand with his wet nose. Maya froze. She looked down through her tears, seeing the milky blue eye and the amber eye staring up at her with pure, undiluted empathy. The dog wasn't asking for anything. He was offering his strength. Slowly, Maya's hand uncurled. Her fingers sank into the thick ruff of fur on Atlas's neck. She didn't pull away. She fell to her knees in the driveway, wrapping her arms around the dog's thick neck, burying her face in his shoulder. The dog who had been called a monster by the whole world closed his eyes and let out a deep sigh, absorbing her sadness, as if he were built for exactly this moment. Elias watched, tears prickling his own eyes. He realized then that Atlas wasn't just a rescue dog. He was the glue putting the shattered pieces of the Thorne family back together. A year later, the silence that had once suffocated the Thorne household was gone, replaced by the chaotic, wonderful sounds of life. Sunday dinners had returned. Maya was there every week, not out of obligation, but because she claimed she needed her Atlas fix. The dog, once too terrified to leave the shadow of the dining table, now ruled the house with a benevolent, snoring despotism. He was still ugly. There was no magical surgery that fixed his twisted jaw, and the scars on his flank would never fully heal. To the delivery drivers and the casual passers-by, he remained a startling sight, a creature that looked like he had crawled out of a rough fairy tale. But inside the walls of Elias's home, the definition of beauty had shifted. Beauty was no longer about symmetry or perfection. Beauty was the way Atlas would press his forehead against Elias's shin when the old grief tried to creep back in. Beauty was the way he had taught a broken family that it was okay to carry scars, as long as you didn't carry them alone. One evening, Elias stood by the mantel, looking at a framed photograph of Sarah. For a long time, looking at her face had brought only pain. Now he smiled. He knew she would have loved Atlas. She would have been the one sneaking him turkey under the table long before Elias ever dared to. He looked down at the rug where Atlas was sleeping, twitching in a dream, likely chasing the rabbits he could never catch in real life. Elias realized that the shelter staff had been wrong that day. They had marked the dog as unadoptable because they thought nobody would want a broken thing. They didn't understand that broken things fit together the best. Elias crouched down and rested his hand on the dog's scarred head. Atlas opened his one good amber eye, thumped his tail once and went back to sleep. He wasn't a gargoyle and he wasn't a monster. He was the most beautiful thing Elias had ever seen, simply because he was loved. And in the end, that was the only destiny that mattered.